Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Releasing Your Inner Dragon with Drake and Marie. I am one of your two hosts, Maxwell Alexander Drake. I'm an award-winning novelist. I teach writing over the world, former lead fiction writer for Sony's EverQuest Next, and a whole bunch of other stuff. You can Google me. As always, my partner in crime is with me.
My name is Marie Mullaney. I write epic fantasy, and I'm also a YouTuber with a channel on fantasy world building.
So today, we're going to talk about, the really exciting topic of punctuation and standardized formatting. But before we get into this amazingly exciting and adventurous topic, make sure, as always, you help us fight the evil algorithm and you like and subscribe. And, all those are great. But for me, what I feel like the most important thing you can do for us to pay us back for the almost 3 years of sweat and slavery we've given to you is just tell another writer about our podcast. It's not that much. Just say, hey, look, I listen to this podcast. They actually have some pretty decent things to say about it. And every once in a while, they'll even make me chuckle once or twice. You should probably listen to them. So we'd appreciate it. All right, so let's get into it. We've talked about punctuation and standardized formatting from time to time, but it is still something that everyone struggles with. And so I'll start off here, and then I'll turn it over to you, Marie, and we'll get into some nuts and bolts.
Mm-hmm.
There's two things that I love to talk about on the high level of punctuation. First of all, most people you have two types of people that punctuate incorrectly. Just one type that just doesn't know. But another type that does it on purpose. And these are the people that really make me angry. Because, inevitably when you ask them, they're like, well, I just like it better. Standardized formatting and punctuation is not for you. It is for the reader. It is a agreed upon set of rules that we're going to follow so that the reader doesn't have to be told every single little aspect. When you write dialogue, you don't have to say, and then pushing air past his vocal cords to make noise, these words came out of his mouth, and then blah, 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 blah. You just put a little quote, say your stuff, and put a little quote. Because the reality is, readers in their minds will hear those words different. You will hear narration one way, you'll hear, inner monologue one way, you'll hear spoken dialogue one way. And, your imagination will make you hear it as if it's said out loud. So this isn't for you. You need to do standardized formatting because it's agreed upon well ahead of time. These are all established things, and they do evolve. Like inner monologue is now pretty much everyone just italicizes it. We don't quote around it. We don't single quote around it. We've done all sorts of things in the past, but now the industries have pretty much gone, you know what, this actually works really well with this italicizing thing. And everybody's kind of set it out. It's taken 30, 40 years to get to that point. So it does slowly evolve like all language does, but you're not going to change it in your one little book. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is the other reason why you should be so insanely focused on punctuation is it's the dumbest way to have the reader pop out of your story. Like it literally is the dumbest, smallest, stupidest mistake you can make that now they're just not seeing the movie in their head anymore. They're just like, they're thrown out because you punctuated incorrectly. They don't understand what you're trying to communicate. And so they're no longer immersed in the story. So those are the two things that I feel like I always go over when I'm talking from a high level thing. It's not, punctuation has nothing to do with you. So just do it. And secondly, you want to do it because you don't want to lose the reader.
So I dived down a rabbit hole in brief preparation for today's conversation, because I knew we were going to be talking about punctuation because it's a reader requested topic. So when I was looking through the comments, I was like, oh, punctuation. So I did an accidental dive down a rabbit hole, which happens to me fairly frequently in my YouTube channel and so on. And I went down a topic which I particularly love, which is the actual evolution of the written word. Yeah? And the history of punctuation. So, and this is relevant because of your point, because punctuation is for the reader. So way back when, when scribes were rare and people who could read were rare and every ruler had like a scribe, whatever, what they would do, these scribes, is they would send each other messages saying like, listen, emphasize this point, do this thing. They would actually have handwritten notes as part of the main missive. And that was like a form, it was actually, and they had very few punctuation marks because they had these personalized notes because they were talking to another scribe that they knew well enough to say, and by the way, how are the wife and kids? Because the leader doesn't know, right, that the scribes, he can't read. He's dependent on his scribe. The scribes are communicating, and what they're saying to their leaders is totally different. Okay, so they had these like whole sentences worth of punctuation marks. Okay. Then punctuation started becoming popular in the medieval times, in the Middle Ages, because of the Bible. At least in Europe, that's when it started becoming popular, because now you had priests reading the Bible and they were reading it to their congregation. And so they needed standardized marks to tell them, when to stop, when to take a pause, and so on and so forth. But really, what truly standardized punctuation was the printing press. Now, I've said it before, I'll say it again. The printing press was one of the most revolutionary inventions known to man. It exploded reading and writing. It changed everything. Everything changed because of the printing press. And the printing press required absolute standardization of punctuation because it needed to become a standard blocklet on the blocks that you put together, the way the press works. And that was when when punctuation was really, really standardized. And of course, when people now start to read, now everybody needs to understand what these marks are. You can't be those scribes back in the old day with like whole notes of like, emphasize this section. And really, this part, my boss says this, but he doesn't mean it. What he actually means is blah, blah, blah.
Right.
You can't do that anymore. You need to now have absolutely standard punctuation because you cannot go and sit next to somebody and say, and this is what I meant here. So, and that's what punctuation is about. And that's, sorry, my rabbit hole that I have now shared with all of you.
Yeah. And just as I said a second ago, it's still evolving to this day.
Yes.
Not as much or as fast, as it did in the past, but still, we don't even write the same. I mean, I've said this before that I really struggle with reading the classics, the stuff that was written in the 1800s or the early 1900s, because it is such a different way of writing.
So I'm gonna hurt your soul, but I'm gonna tell you that emojis are an evolution of punctuation, because they are effectively like a little mark that tells you how the sentence is supposed to be read.
Or at least so like I'll say something in an email that could be taken as offensive, and then I'll put a smiley face after it, and then I'll put a parentheses with an arrow that says, I added a smiley face so you can't get mad. And I do that all the time. Yeah. Because it's, you don't get emotions when and we've talked about this before about, why we write prose different than we actually speak. And so anytime in any way that you can put in, matter of fact, I think I even did it in the first creative writing book. I think I did it a couple of times where I was like, you can't get angry. I put a smiley face. So yeah, it is a way of exactly that. Now, if you're going to do it in a prose piece, it also has to match the tone of that prose. I mean, like my serious epic fantasy or your serious epic fantasy, you start putting smiley faces or winky faces or whatever, you're going to really throw the reader out of that. Yes. But I could see it in an evolution, like in, if somebody is now the new Terry Pratchett writing a really slapstick kind of thing, I can absolutely, see that. And one of the projects that I'm kind of toying with on the side is a comedy lit RPG story. So I haven't put.
Yeah, that would be a good.
I haven't put them in yet, but like when you were saying that, I was like, I actually probably could get away with it in that book because it is so silly and so dumb.
I think also like an urban fantasy could potentially have emoticons, like a modern day urban fantasy.
It depends on
the tone. To some
right.
degree.
I don't think you can do it in Harry Potter. Now
No.
you can always, especially if it's modern, you could always do it if you do the
Text.
yeah, you're showing what a text looks like. So you hit this thing and you format it differently so they know it is the actual text between the characters. But then you're really in another form of dialogue.
Yes.
It's now written dialogue as opposed to inner dialogue or verbal dialogue.
Yeah.
And of course you can do anything in there. Now, could you put a smiley face in verbal dialogue? I don't think so, because no one says, because if I was going to do that, I would literally then write the word smiley face.
Yeah.
And that might be something that like a quirk that the character does or something like that. And of course, at that point, I would have somebody call them on it, because that's another thing that I don't think people realize as much as they should. You can deviate and you can adjust and you can do things to a certain extent, but you have to teach the reader individually. So like I actually do inner monologue a little different than I've ever seen anybody else do it. And so the first time I use inner monologue, I actually kind of teach the reader, this is inner monologue. And I do it in a very organic way. Like I'll say, the thought rankled his honor or something like that. But there's always the word thought, like right there at the next sentence. And then I'll do that 2 or 3 times. I'll do it the first time you see it, the second time you see it, I might skip one, and then I'll do a third time, but then I'll never do it again. Because by that point, in my opinion, anybody who's smart enough to read should have figured out, oh, okay, these are all inner monologues. And then I'm literally, now I've taught you this. It's the same thing. We went in the writer's room for our monthly training session. I went down the path of fantasy speak and unique words and all of that stuff. And it was the same thing. Like, if you're going to use a made up word, great. But, we don't want to do it the old way where you're like, and then the gore lab, and then brackets, a gore lab is a, winged creature from the pit. Like, we don't do that anymore. That ruins the entire thing. So you have to look for organic ways to introduce this fantasy speak and then teach the reader what you mean by this word. Yeah. So it's the same thing with punctuation.
So I think that one of the first things that we should talk about in punctuation is just the absolute basics of like what the punctuation marks actually are. Yeah, so your most basic punctuation marks are things that separate sentences, which is your stop, your comma, your semicolon, and your colon. Yeah, and they have. So it used to be that a comma is a 1 beat, a semicolon's a 2 beat, a colon is a 3 beat, and a period is a 4 beat. That was the actual official means in which it is. These days, it's probably still kind of the same, but the principle is a colon separates interrelated clauses. A semicolon is a sentence, one sentence that has not related clauses. A period separates a complete sentence. And a colon is weird, okay? I have found one reason to use a colon, and in prose. And it was a sentence that where the dude was asked what's wrong, and he thinks, like, his thought is like, he wanted to scream, and then I put a colon, everything. But he couldn't do that because blah blah blah. It's the only time I've ever found a purpose for a colon. But
see, even there, the way you described that, I would do I would probably still just do a comma and then italicize everything and add an exclamation point onto it. So even there, you could format it in different ways, because you're right. Colons are
weird.
They just really have no place in prose. Yeah.
They're a very good purpose for them in nonfiction writing. They work really well in nonfiction writing, obviously. I mean, in nonfiction writing, they're like, and here follows the list of things, or here follows the whatever.
But you shouldn't be doing lists in
in
prose. That's boring to read. it's a completely different animal when we're in
Yeah.
that. So yeah, and even like semicolons, my base rule is never use a semicolon in prose. However, I use them often. And when I say often, I might use 10 of them in a novel, 150,000 word novel. Because in prose, at least, a semicolon basically separates two complete sentences, but they are tightly connected to complete sentences, but not tight enough that you put a comma between them. But a period also connects two sentences and you put them in the same paragraph. So like they're really redundant.
I will admit that semicolon is the one, like I will go words out of my way to eliminate the semicolon. Like a sentence has to be absolutely perfect with a semicolon for me to decide to keep it. And even then, I'll probably just replace it with a comma and go, yes, I know, it's a splice. I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, I won't do it with a comma, but the period, because the period does the exact same thing as a semicolon. The times that I use it, and like I said, I do it often for a semicolon, maybe 10, 15 times in a novel. But it's always because the two sentences are so married and joined at the hip, and they're so, everything in a paragraph should be related. So that's why most of the time it's just a period in between them. But sometimes, every once in a while, I just run into two sentences that literally are so intimate with each other. They're a mated pair. And so that's the only time when those two sentences really need to be read as one, but they are two complete sentences. That's the time where I'll be like, you know what, this is going to get a semicolon.
So there, if I find two sentences like that, I often use an M dash to connect them rather than a semicolon. The reason why I'm so anti-semicolons actually got nothing to do with prose or grammar. It's because I'm a computer programmer.
Yeah.
And I'm a C language computer programmer. So in my head, a semicolon means end of instruction. Like, and to me, it's always a reminder of the real world. And it's always like a end of instruction, new line, new set of instructions, like.
Right. Yeah.
And that is a very hard habit to break.
The funny thing is that as an author, you need to, especially like me, I'm, as a fantasy author, or you as a fantasy author, what's the percentage of our fan base that are computer geeks? So just because I was a computer geek too, I was just hardware and your software. So the semicolon doesn't have that same effect on me. But how many of my fans are actual programmers? And so like that is something to think about, that you're going to have some of your fans that are going to hit that semicolon, and it is going to trigger a different response from them than you're expecting because of their real world life.
Yeah.
So it is important. That's why I said I don't use them very often, and it has to really, really scream, and I even saying 10 to 15 times in a novel might be too much. I might not even use them that much. I use them occasionally. They are there. So I'm definitely not going to say don't use them in prose. However, you really shouldn't use them in prose. It's a shouldn't use them in prose, not a don't use them in prose.
Yeah.
Because they are redundant. I mean, that's the big thing for me, because a period does the exact same thing. It separates two sentences that are complete sentences. Where I see a lot of them is where they use semicolons in between a independent clause, a complete sentence, and a dependent clause, a fragmented sentence. So like that's not even grammatically correct.
And you don't need it.
That's not how this works. See, so you mentioned the M dash. That's what I use M dash for in prose, is I have a fragmented sentence. So there's two ways that I use fragmented sentences. One is for punch. So it's, and I've used this before, the opening of the Genesis saga where, he's looking up at the ceiling, and it reminds him of the fact that he's somebody else's property. And so before it says, it describes the beams, and then there's just a one-word sentence that says foreboding. And the next is a one-word sentence that says oppressive. And so those are punches. I'm literally forcing the reader to read a one-word sentence. And not only that, they each get their own paragraph just to even make them even more stand out. Or I will use fragmented sentences to add something to a sentence, but not for the punch, but for the add. And that's where I put that M dash in there. So I've got this fragmented sentence. It's definitely a part of this other sentence. It's a part of it. You could rework all of these and work them into complex sentences. So you could definitely rework the sentence so that it is a comma instead of an M dash, 100%. But because M dashes are so accepted in the fantasy genre, now I don't know about other genres, but in the fantasy genre, no fantasy fan gets thrown out by an M dash because we've been using M dashes in this genre forever. So that's really what an M dash is going to be used for me. It's going to be that fragmented sentence that isn't there for a punch as a standalone fragmented sentence. It's actually adding information to the sentence that you're reading, but it's not a complete sentence. And it's also not technically supposed to go there with a comma. Like it literally is this weird throw out that isn't really connected from a grammatical standpoint. Yeah. It's 100% connected from a communication standpoint. And so that's where I'll
an M dash.
M dashes.
Yeah. For an M dash, for those who don't know, is basically a double hyphen. It's two hyphens.
And actually, it's what? Is it Control Alt minus or just Control?
No, Control Alt minus on your number pad makes an M dash in Windows.
That is now, you taught me that, and it is now the only way I do them. So I used to, in Word, you can, when you have one, you can hit two minuses. And then if you hit a letter after that, the next time you hit a space, it will create as an M dash. So if you have an M dash between two words, you can write a word, do two dashes, write the next word. And then as soon as you hit the space, it'll magically turn those two dashes into an M dash. And that actually works as well. But now being able to hit that hotkey, because the other, sometimes like with, if you're going to put it at the end of a sentence to show that the sentence was interrupted, you always have to backspace and delete. So like I would have to do two minus signs, the letter A, space, it creates the M dash, then I have to backspace twice to get rid of the space and the A, and then add my close quote. And like, it's just extra typing. And now when I do that, I just hit that Control Alt minus, it's there, close quote, keep on moving.
I love that hotkey. It's a great hotkey. Yeah. It's Control Alt and the minus sign on your numpad.
On the numpad, not the minus sign up above the P.
Yeah.
So yeah, ever since you taught me that, I immediately incorporated that into how I work, and now it's the only thing that I do when I'm doing it.
So that's an M dash, and I think I really do like that. And then I guess like I do want to talk about dialogue and punctuation, so we'll get there. But before we talk about dialogue and punctuation, I want to talk about paragraph indentation, scene structure, capitalization, and big letters, and so on. So the actual structure of a book. So let's first talk about why is the leading sentence of a paragraph indented in a book. It is to offset the start of the paragraph. It is so that for the reader, there is a clear visual distinction between the paragraphs without putting a line break, without putting a huge ass gap, because you don't want big gaps that basically bulk the book out to like 1 million pages. Paper isn't that cheap.
And I actually think that's where that came from.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, you did have that extra space between the paragraphs. Like that's one of the things annoying about Word these days. And I've noticed that over the last 5 or 6, 7 years, they've gone back to automatically, like the default font in Word when you start using it puts like too much space between the lines, in my opinion. And then also it even increases that when you do the new paragraph. And I'm like, why are you doing this? Stop. Like, I don't want this. But I actually do think that, I don't know this for a fact, but I will bet, because I think originally we always had that big line break and we didn't have indents. We had between every paragraph, you had a little extra, like a half an extra line. And I think that when we came to start making books and you have, 100,000 paragraphs in a novel, that's 100,000 extra blank lines. And somebody went, instead of doing that, what if we just have like 5 spaces at the beginning of a sentence, and then we can, cut out 30, 40 pages out of this novel that we don't have to buy and print and ship and everything else. And so I would be willing to bet that that was a financially motivated change as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it was the fiction publishing industry that did it, because the academic publishing industry, which is obviously, one of the big dominant forces, they don't have the same concerns, right? Like, yes, they do. Obviously, they don't want to waste money, but
when you charge $150 for a book,
yes, exactly. They publish at a different price point, so they don't care so much about the cost of paper.
Yeah, and I'd be willing to bet in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, when the pulp fiction started coming out.
Yeah.
I mean, you're paying 99 cents or $1.99, or when I was, in the 70s, most of those books were $3.99.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be willing to bet it was how small and how crammed and how, what can we do to cut every single cost that we possibly can?
If you think of like a mass market trade paperback, like those flimsy little books, like they're crammed on the margins, they're tight, the font is small, so that they can sell them for like, a couple of bucks. So, but it has set a standard, okay? And because they did it then, and because everybody's grown up with it, it is absolutely ingrained in the readers, all readers. It's now just become the standard. So that a paragraph must be indented at the start, and this to a reader separates paragraphs. Now you create paragraphs out of, this is the things that is happening in this section, and you put a paragraph break so that the reader can reset their mind and consume the next piece of information.
Yeah, the way I teach it is punctuation is there for the reader to swallow the information you just gave. The reason why run-on sentences are so bad, unless it's all the same information, is they don't swallow into the end. So if it's one thing, like if it's Drake went into the kitchen, got a pot, filled it with water, and put it on the stove to heat, and then you swallow, they're all commas, and then you got a period at the end. Everybody has done that. It's all this very common one kind of motion, even though there's a lot of things going on. And so that run-on sentence is, I'm going to write that 1,000,000 times because it's not going to throw anyone out. But if you write a run-on sentence of Spider-Man leapt onto the ledge, comma, shot another web to the adjacent building, comma, flung himself into the air, comma, and swung to the, through the open window, period. Like, those are very different actions that aren't that run-on sentence. When I get to the end of it, I'm not going to remember, I'm not going to have visualized that, the beauty of what you were describing. I'm just going to cram it all together, just like I do with the boiling a pot of water. It's just going to cram together. But one doesn't matter and you can get away with it, and the other one does matter, and you've actually hurt your story because of it.
I also want to put in there as well, because I've seen this quite a lot, is like people will add pieces of information about, like in your example. So let's take your Spider-Man example. Spider-Man leapt onto the shaky ledge, shot a silver web, catapulted himself toward the gray wall, and then scurried up to the crenellated roof. Okay. Now you don't just have 4 pieces of information. You've just crammed 8 pieces of information in the reader's head.
Yeah.
And this is what I've started doing for myself, is when I start feeling the sentence is too big, I count the exact number of pieces of information that I'm giving the reader, and I count those one-word descriptions, like it's this kind of a ladder or that kind of whatever. I count them as separate pieces of information. And if I've hit 3 in a sentence, I'm like, okay, time to start. The ideal is actually, in my opinion, more like 2-ish, but 3 you can do, 4 if it's a common thing that is introducible, but over 4, you better have a very good reason for it.
I don't even know if you can have a good reason for that, but because even like because again, it's when the brain swallows the information as a whole to consume it. So even like my example of the kitchen, Drake sauntered in the kitchen, tripping over the whatever the thing is called. Huh?
The lazy dog.
Okay, the lazy dog. Got himself an old banged up rusty pot, filled it from the half working or the leaking sink, and then put it on the creaky stove. Like when you have so much information, you just lose it. Like the reader they're just going to see he filled up a pot of water to boil. They're going to lose all those detail moments. And if those details are important, which if they're not, they shouldn't be in there. But if it's important that there's a lazy dog there, and it's important that it's a banged up, beat up pot, and it's important that the sink is a leaky sink, and it's important that the stove is a creaky stove, like maybe we're trying to show how poor Drake actually is. I mean, we already said he was a writer, so that should literally tell you how poor he is. But if we need more, then we're going to go into those details. Well, you're going to want to break those out in their own individual sentences, because then, Drake walked in the kitchen tripping over his lazy dog that should have been taken to the pound a month ago, whatever. So now it's like, oh, the dog is important. Browsing through his massive collection of 2 pots, he chose the one that was the least rusty of the group. Like, okay, sentence. Now you're like, oh, wow. Like, so now we're actually through subtext, we are showing things in this very mundane, he just walks into the kitchen, fills a pot of water and puts it on the stove to heat. But we're each one of these now at the period is when they swallow, and they actually then kind of think about what they just swallowed. So when you're like, especially if you do dichotomies, like his massive collection of 2 pots, like everyone knows that that's, not consistent. So they're, it's going to force them to have to kind of figure out why you wrote it in this way. And they're just going to consume that subtext that you're trying to get them to consume. But if you put all that in a single run-on sentence, all those details are going to get lost.
All gone.
They're just not going to, they're not going to matter to the reader.
And if you think a semicolon is going to fix that problem, you're also wrong. That is absolutely a period problem. Like, you need periods there.
Yeah.
And then
100%.
If you then want to say, like, Drake's wife called out to him from the living room, that's a new paragraph. Because now you've had all the action in the kitchen. It's all been Drake, it's all been kitchen, it's all been boiling the pot of water. Now there's a new activity coming from a new actor. Paragraph break.
So the way I like to teach it is paragraph structure is very simple. It's one moment of 100% related time. Now, the reason why I say it that way is it could be half a second. You could have an entire paragraph with 15 sentences in it that's a half a second long. You could also have a paragraph that's only 4 or 5 sentences that's 2 years long, but they're all related. So like in the 2-year one, it'd be, time rolled by faster than Drake would ever assume. Summer became fall, became winter, became spring, became summer, became winter, became fall. Like, and then we just went through 2 years in just a paragraph. But it's what is happening. Time is flowing. We're showing time. So it's all the same related thing. So like in what you were saying about the kitchen, everything Drake's doing in the kitchen to fill this pot of water is all related, and it might take a minute and a half or whatever. But now another character is going to do something that's not Drake filling a pot of water. So that's going to get its own paragraph. And then that, however long that takes, it's so your paragraphs are a moment of time. Whether that moment is short or long depends on what the paragraph is doing, but it's always 100% related to itself.
And to me as well here, I just want to say, like, if you find yourself with like I know my cat's being very if you find yourself with like a 50 for those of you who are not on YouTube, who are just listening to us, my cat is sitting behind me
like 8-year-olds.
Yeah. My cat is sitting behind me licking herself. So so the thing about paragraphs is if you're hitting like 15 sentences worth of paragraphs, you've probably, unless they're short sentences, and I'm not saying you definitely have, but you've probably gone a little bit overboard. Because again, from a reader's perspective, so for me, when a paragraph starts consuming like half the page or something like that, I start getting like a little bit of like paragraph fatigue. I want this piece of information to be done now. So be careful of your paragraph length, even if it is all related information, even if you feel it's all related information. Be aware of the effect that it has on the reader and maybe find a reason to break it up.
Yeah, agreed. I'm just, I don't know if I've ever gone 15 sentences. I was just going to open something of mine and just kind of, because my paragraphs can be longer, and they are definitely longer now than when I first started writing. And it's almost always going to be in dialogue scenes.
So dialogue's a funny one because dialogue can run long, but even there, I like to break up. Like if I start hitting big dialogue, kind of monologue-ish things, I try and break it up with something, whether it's an action or a reaction or a thought process or, something.
All right, here, I actually found something that might actually be, so this might actually be a good paragraph to kind of give a lot of this stuff. So this is an intro chapter. I'm introducing magic that, in this world. This is the first time you've seen this magic and all of this. And so the paragraph is kind of long. I don't know how many sentences we're at here. 1, 2, there's an M dash thing in here. 3, 4, 5, 6. And there's some longer sentences. So one of the things that you'll notice in my writing, and this is just my writing style, because we want to constantly vary ourselves as we're writing sentences. So you want sentences that are shorter, you want sentences that are longer. So one of the things that I've done to help me always make sure that I'm rotating is that I've kind of trained myself that when action is going on, I just naturally shorten my sentences. And when description is going on, I naturally lengthen my sentences. And it's because, in my opinion, again, this is all subjective, but in my opinion, when you're in description mode without any action or anything like that, so like that Spider-Man example would be an action thing. That's not description thing. Readers are much more able to consume this stuff when it's description. So like we go through this paragraph, with emotions under control, comma, he breathed in through his nose, comma, letting out slowly through his mouth. So a little bit longer sentence, but he's just taking a breath. So you're just getting this one action. Fixing upon the outstretched hands of his shadowy teacher, comma, Malant allowed the floating dots, M dash, spectacles, he reminded himself, M dash, to differentiate from one from the other on their own, comma, like he'd been taught. So technically, this is an incredibly long sentence, but only one thing is happening. He's just focusing on dots and letting them, whatever that means, differentiate from themselves. And then the M dash is extra information, but I want it in the sentence.
I would still like that sentence is bordering on too much for me, because we've got fixing upon the so there's a teacher. The teacher is shadowy. The teacher has outstretched hand. Malant allows the floating dots to differentiate. So there's floating dots, allows them to differentiate from one another like he'd been taught. And that's without the M dash component.
Yep.
It's a lot. It's
so here's why it works for me.
Yeah.
We already know there's a teacher. We've already described the teacher. We already know there's dots. We've already described the dots. We already know he's in a class. So none of this is new information. The only thing that's new information in this sentence is the word spectacles. That's it. The reader already has every single bit of all the rest of this information. So that's why, to me, it's not egregious, because of the fact that the only thing new I'm giving them. So like when we were talking about like the kitchen example or the Spider-Man example, all of those things are new. Like we've never been to that ledge before, so we don't know that it's shaky. We don't know that his webs are silvery. We don't know like all those different things. If they're all new information, to me, that's very egregious. So, and again, all this stuff is subjective. So Marie wouldn't write it this way, and there's nothing, that doesn't mean she's wrong. She's 100% right. I would write it this way. It doesn't mean I'm wrong. I'm 100% right. It's all subjective on what you feel is what you're comfortable with what you want to do as with your structure, with your sentences, how you want to relate information to the readers, and so on and so forth.
Can I say one other thing? Please, please, please cut that himself. It bothers me. Like he reminded himself. It feels almost like he thought to himself.
Yeah, but there's no other way to say it. Like, how would you say? I mean, I guess I could write he remembered, but I hate that. I literally hate he remembered. Spectles, he remembered. And you can't write spectles, he reminded.
Yeah. But fuck that. It bugs me because I'm like, but who else would he be reminding?
Okay, but how else? What's a different way to write this? And still, I mean, I could completely rewrite the entire sentence.
No.
And because remember, what is the only new thing that I'm giving here? The only new thing I'm giving here is what are the dots called? So you've seen these dots up here. Again, opens, reality world, like a kaleidoscope of color swimming across Mont's field of vision. So, we've got these dizzying array of colors, and, we find out that it's the site of Sukai, whatever that means, because we don't know yet. Multitude of swirling colors. So all of this stuff, we know that, I've really hammered.
So why don't you put that spectals, he reminded himself, why don't you put that area between the emphasis, between the two M dashes, as internal monologue, where he goes like, where the internal monologue is spectals. Mm-hmm. They're called spectals.
I could absolutely do that. The problem that I have with that is how I write inner monologue. Now I have to create it as its own separate paragraph. And do I really want to do that? And then also remember what my rule is on the difference between writing an inner monologue and not. To me, it has to add a deeper punch than if it was in narration.
So I would argue that spectals, that are called spectals, does have a deeper punch than the filtery he reminded himself.
Yeah, no, and that would be a valid argument, 100%. Mm-hmm. I'm not arguing that at all.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that now I have to rejigger my paragraph structure so that I have a paragraph that leads into the inner monologue that leads into a paragraph. So it's just a lot of rewriting. Yeah. And it's all to get rid of that one word himself. Like for you listening, it shows the level of scrutiny that we each give to not only our own writer, but each other's writing as well. Because it is that important in my opinion. Now, it is that important to us. Is anybody reading this as a fan gonna even notice the difference between the two? Probably not. But you could say that. That's one way to look at it. It's like, oh wow, Drake and Marie, they're a little bit insane on this one word. But you got to understand, it's not this one word, this one sentence. It's every sentence we write. And when you add this little bit of detail, this pushing yourself a little harder as a writer on everything, then the entire manuscript is better. So if everything was garbage and then we focused on this one sentence and we just fixed this one sentence to this level and it's a fix that no one may notice, sure, that's not worth it. But me and Marie both spend this much effort and time and scrutiny on everything. So when you add up these little minute betterments, because that's really what they are, you're improving it just a little bit better. Yeah. When you add up enough of those just a little bit betters, they become majorly better in the entire piece. So yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with what you're saying. I don't, and I haven't edited this chapter of my, because I'm doing my final edit. I know I've gone through these things a million times, but this is my last draft through it, and then it goes out to beta readers because this gets published before the end of the year.
Yeah.
I've kind of, I mean, one of the reasons why I've wallowed in this is because I've never really had a deadline. And so I've had the advantage of just like, well, I'm just going to keep working on it until I can't work on it anymore. And now oh, right, it's got to be out by December. So I can't work on it anymore. It's got to be published. So yeah, now I'm changing in how I'm dealing with this rewrite, and I'm now just getting it done. But yeah, so it is subjective. You do have to think about it and how you want to do it. You have to have your reasons. And like when I'm editing my students or my, the members of the writer's room or my private clients, my number one thing is if I pop them on something and they go, here's the reason why I know I broke the rule, and here's the reason why I did it. Now, whether I agree with that reason or not is beside the point. But it does mean that they thought about it, and it does mean that they go that they've put effort behind it, and that to me is still a million times better than just, I don't know, I just wrote it that way. It just sounded right to me.
So I agree. You can always break the rules, based on your decision of how it sounds. I mean, you must write in your own authorial voice and not in anybody else's authorial voice. I think my paragraphs, if you've read me, my paragraphs tend to be short. My sentences tend to be short. I'm compact.
Yeah. And so with me, especially when it comes to when I'm in my description mode, when I'm in my what I call my narration mode, I will let my sentences get longer. And again, I do it on purpose. It's my writing voice. It's my writing style. And why do I do that? So again, this is all subjective. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just giving you my reasons for doing them. The reason why I do that is, what am I the most famous for? Action and fight scenes. And when I allow the sentences to get longer when things are slower, and then I compact them when things start getting faster, it gives just one more little thing to me that makes you feel like the action is really ramping up, because now I'm doing all these little sentences. And then, okay, now I can take a breather and I can slow down my reading, and now I'm a little bit. And so that's one of the pacing tricks that I use for making my action feel so much more actiony, because when I get into my narration, I'm slowing the reader down. I'm literally on purpose. And that's just a pacing style that I adopted 20 years ago and just been getting, honing, whether you like it or not. And I'm not talking to you, Marie, I'm saying to the average person, whether you like it or not is that's for the fan to decide, and that's why you're never going to please everybody. So you just do the best you can, and you are still shooting for that 8 out of 10. If 8 out of 10 people are enjoying what you're doing, you'll never get it perfect. You'll never please 100% of the people. So you have to decide. Now, if you're only pleasing 10% of the people, you're probably doing something wrong, or at least you're not going to be successful with it, because you can't make a living off of having 9 people hate your writing and 1 person liking it, because there'll be so many bad reviews that you won't get people reading your stuff. And that's just the way it is. So anyway, kind of getting back there, there's an example though of how I would use an M dash.
Yes.
So I'm shoving in this piece of information that technically is 100% related to the sentence, but it doesn't fit. Yeah. It's this break in it. So I'm going to use those M dashes to pop you out of the sentence for a moment of information, and then let you get back into the sentence. Within a few heartbeats, a square shape emerged, becoming distinct from the background. The object didn't take on any actual form, period. Rather, comma, the colored spectacles inside. And notice now, I've trained you what the word spectacles are. So I gave you about 4 paragraphs of him looking at colored dots, and I described the colored dots, and I described them like angry bees and all this other stuff. So I let you get used to the fact that this person, this character, was looking at the world and everything was just colored dots for some reason. Then you get here, and the spectacles line is me, telling you what these things are called. From there on out, I don't call them colored dots. I mean, I do every once in a while because you want to be very, but I don't, that's not what they're now named. Now I've taught you what they look like first. I let you get comfortable with that so that I don't have to go, like the other way to do it would be, you know, spectals floated in front of Malant's vision. Spectals looked like colored dots and were what a mage saw when they were a Masukai and they're looking at this, you know, like that's very telly to me. To me, it's so much more organic to just give you what they are. This is just what you see. This is what the monster looks like or whatever. And then allow you to get the name kind of after that so that you can, you know, put the two together. And of course, it's going to differentiate depending on where you're at in your story and what you're trying to do. And that's just one way to do it. And so, I mean, we can keep reading the paragraph, but that gave you the point. It's, oh, wait, no, I do want to finish it because we were talking about paragraphs.
And then I want to talk about something else because it reminded me looking at the paragraph, a thing that we also don't agree on.
Okay. The object didn't take on any actual form, period. Rather, comma, the colored spectrals inside whatever Sarlamac held appeared connected, comma, interconnected in a way Malant still failed to understand, comma, even after 2 seasons of training with Sukai. Soon, a period, soon, comma, other patterns emerged, comma, and the room's contents took shape in the bright, comma, multicolored sight of Sukai. So all of this is interconnected. It's all him just looking around the room. That's all that's happening. So it's one event, one character. It's one moment of time for one character. So it's all one paragraph. And literally the only thing that's happening is he's just trying to figure out what he's looking at. That's it. It's all the same thing. So, but now the next paragraph is a very short paragraph. It is still Malant. So I haven't even changed characters to the next paragraph. The next paragraph is, once Malant was certain of his surroundings, comma, he found the confidence to answer, period. Quote, you hold a book, seer, period, end quote. Even though it's the same character, the first was him looking around. The second is him saying something. Now, you can absolutely say something while they're looking around, but they need to be connected in that movement. In the reason why these are separate paragraphs to me is in the first one, he's doing something. He's trying to figure out what he's seeing. And in the second paragraph, he feels like he's figured it out and now he's going to act upon the information. So paragraphs can get tough. It is subjective. Could I have put it in this last paragraph? Absolutely. But also the last paragraph is pretty long. So that's another reason to kind of break it up, is just to do that. And then, of course, the next paragraph is his instructor answering him. So now it's a different character. So we are absolutely in a new paragraph because now it's that character's actions and dialogue in their own moment of time in their own separate paragraph. So, all right, you had something that we disagree on.
I want to talk about capitalization.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because we were going to do that.
So this is one of the places where Drake and I do have a difference, and that is in what should be capitalized. So let's first talk about what absolutely must be capitalized. The start of a sentence, always capitalized, without exception, unless you have a spectacular reason for not capitalizing it. I will say that I have seen it non-capitalized when you have dialogue written from the perspective of an extremely submissive person talking to an extremely dominant person, in which case it's a deliberate choice. But that is a completely different genre. So generally, start of a sentence capitalized. Names capitalized. And by names, I mean proper nouns. So all proper nouns, as far as I know, should be capitalized.
Yes.
Titles, by and large, should not. The only titles that should be capitalized is if they are with the person's name. So, like, Duchess de la Roche is capitalized, but the Duchess is not.
Right. The Duchess de la Roche.
Yeah. The Duchess de la Roche is capitalized because it's a proper noun. The Duchess is not. So, for example, like, and the example I actually saw was the American speaker. They were like, speaker, blah, 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 is capitalized. You capitalize the S. But when you talk about the speaker, it's not capitalized. It's a small letter. Then with things like, now I made a deliberate choice in Sangwell Chronicles that I would always capitalize the word the emperor, because in Lumiaron, people capitalize the emperor in their heads. That's how they speak, right? And you can do the same. Like, I also took the decision to capitalize the names of the gods. When I talk about the right-hand god, the left-hand god, the goddess, that's always with a capital G, because people speak with, they think about these things in capital letters, the same way that, Christians capitalize G, God with a G. So you can absolutely capitalize things like that, things that aren't normally capitalized. That being said, I would never have capitalized spectals or patterns. And the reason why is because magic in your world, as it is in mine, is a tool, right? And we don't capitalize screws or bolts or nuts or atoms and so I wouldn't capitalize them.
Yep. The reason why I capitalize them is just to stress them to the reader, for the reader to so if you're not looking at the thing, or if you're not looking at YouTube and you're just listening to us, that M dash where it M dashed out and it says spectals, he reminded himself. Spectals is capitalized. And then in the last paragraph where it says soon, comma, other patterns emerge, comma, and the room's contents. So patterns, spectals, that's one that people might go either way on. A lot of people might go either way on it, because it is a proper noun of what these things are. So like screws are one thing, but if you had a specific screw that has a name for a specific job, and I can't think of any because you use screws. But let's say we have a screw that is only used for this thing, and it's a special thing, and it has its own name. It's a, whatever. I can't even come up with something that would be screws. That's a hard one to get there. But if it was, it might be capitalized. The patterns one is one I'll definitely give you, because patterns is also just a regular word. It's just a word that exists. And, what's the difference between soon other patterns emerge, capital pattern, versus soon other patterns emerge, lowercase? So the reason why I capitalize it is because it isn't a pattern in the sense of like the patterns of a dress or the patterns of, a quilt or whatever. They are called patterns. That's how the language has developed. Now, wait.
Yeah.
So the big dichotomy difference between me and Marie is I capitalize things that are unique to my world, that I want the reader to read as unique to my world. Right or wrong, that's the choice that I made a long time ago, and that's what I do. And it just, to me, my opinion, it makes the reader, when they hit them, know that this is a special word and not the same as, especially words that are common, like pattern. To me, it's just saying, hey, this isn't a pattern like what you use the word pattern for. This is actually something above that. And so I capitalize it. And again, right or wrong, there is no right or wrong. It's subjective.
But it does bring up an interesting difference between the reason why I don't capitalize it, and at the very beginning, I thought about italicizing those words. And then I was like, actually, I don't like them jumping off the page like that. And here's why. Like, the reason why I don't do it, right, is because in my world, the people don't see these things in capital letters. Okay. Right. These are normal words for them. They are normal words that they interact with in a normal way, that have a normal meaning within the context of their word. And I don't want the reader paying special attention to them. I want the reader consuming the word, consuming the whole thing, and treating the word like a normal thing, because I want the reader entirely immersed in the world and just consuming it all. So, and that's why I don't capitalize.
And I guess that is the kernel. We've talked about this for years between me and you. I mean, we wrote a book together, so we had to have this discussion. But I think you just hit on, for the first time, the true dichotomy that exists. You don't want the reader to have any experience outside of what an actual native person inside the world would experience. And I actually am almost author intruding and making the reader know that this is something different from their own world. And again, it's just a different way of looking at how you want to tell the story. There's no right or wrong way. But I never thought about it like that until you just said that. Until you said, I want my reader to consume it as if they were just a living, breathing person inside that world. And that's an awesome reason. I mean, that is 100% legit. But I want my readers to, it's almost like I'm tapping them on the shoulder and saying, hey, pay attention to this one word. You know, this word is different than what you think it might be. This is special to this world. And you don't know that because you're not from this world. So I'm kind of pointing it out so the italicized unique words bothers me. And it bothers me for several reasons. First of all, it's because we use it as inner monologue. And second of all, we use it to stress words. So when authors, like, let's say they italicize spectals, since we're talking about that.
Yeah.
I'm always going to read them of the colored spectacles inside whatever Sarlamac. Like, it's always going to be this stressed word to me. And it's like, no, it's not, you know. So I don't like the italics, because to me, when you have an italicized word that isn't inner monologue, it's because it's being stressed. It's supposed to be read differently at a different level than the other words in that same sentence. So I've always hated that as well. I don't like I'm going to italicize my unique words, because that does throw me out. I will say this. I get very few complaints, you know, on a regular. I mean, I'm not saying like, oh, I didn't understand this sentence, or, oh, you misspelled this word, or anything like that. I'm just as privy to, you know, prone to those as every other writer. I get very few complaints on my voice. Like, every one of us have read authors that, even if we like, we're like, but they do this thing that I hate. I get very few of those, almost none. But one of them is, I'll get an email every once in a while. It's like, man, I love everything you're doing, but man, you capitalize too much. It annoys me.
So I will say that one of the things that is said about my writing, and it's not said in a negative sense, but it is said, is I occasionally have the comment of, your world building is so dense.
Yeah.
Or I have to read your book slower because the world building is so dense. Because I don't capitalize anything. I don't explain unless it is relevant to right now. I just use the thing and assume the reader will keep up.
Yep. And for the most part, I'm that way too.
Yeah.
One of the few things that I do is I will just capitalize those words. And I will say this, and I think you've had a huge role in this. I don't capitalize as many words as I used to.
When we started with Magic Fall, you wanted to capitalize Jiren and this, and I was like, no, I'm going to battle the capitals.
Well, that one I didn't even fight you on it, because
I know.
Because I wrote that first chapter just not even thinking about it, and then you were like, hey, I hate all these capitals. Like, oh yeah, right, you hate capitals. Let's just change them. I didn't even because it literally is that kind of subjective on the writing of it. Will I take it out of my personal writing? Probably not. It's still something that I don't know. To me, you know, like the site of Sukai.
So the site of Sukai, I probably leave. So because I do things like that as well. Like Trials of Dusang is capitalized, right? Mm-hmm. Because people think of them as a capital letter thing.
Right.
It's a thing. It's a ritual. It's a thing. It's like Christmas. You know, it's a thing. But the reason why I wouldn't capitalize Spectral is the same reason I wouldn't capitalize Elamar. It's the basis of magic. It's something every mage has and understands it's a tool.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my, so I would like Sight of Sakai would be fine. I wouldn't throw a bullet.
So the funny thing is, and again, I haven't edited this chapter, so I haven't even gotten here yet. The funny thing is that I'm about 95% sure that I'm going to leave spectals capitalized.
Yeah.
But I'm probably 80% sure that I'm going to lowercase patterns.
Yeah.
Because it is so close to being a common word.
Yeah. Patterns,
and that's really,
yeah.
well, that's really where you've changed, where you've had an impact on me, because now I scrutinize my capitalizations more.
Yeah.
And this is the first chapter that magic is introduced. Mm-hmm. So this is the first time I would have even looked at this. So yeah, that is one of the things that I have been, and again, I think you had probably more of an impact on that on me than any other person in my career. But I still like to capitalize things. It's just there's no right or wrong way.
No. These are made up words in made up concepts. How, if you feel that it adds to capitalize them, capitalize them. Yeah. If you feel that it adds to your narrative in your world to capitalize them, capitalize them. It's just
as long as the vast majority of your readers also don't even notice it. Yeah. So,
but what I think that you should think about when you're deciding whether you're going to capitalize or not capitalize is think about the impact on the reader. Because for me, as a reader, a capital is an immediate jump off the page, especially when it's not a name. It's a thing that immediately leaps toward me. So do you want that every time this word is mentioned? Do you want the reader to zero in and focus on that word? Or do you want the reader to just consume the word and move along? Right? Because that really, like, as I say, I have weird words, man. I had one dude tell me that the word Elamar, which is spelled E-L-M-A with a dot on it, A with a dot on it, M-M-A with a dot on it, A with a dot on it. He was like, this word is ridiculous. It cannot exist. What is this even? You're just putting on dots for the joke of it. Like, it's stupid. And I was like, okay, firstly, that's an actual Finnish word. Like, it is a for reals Finnish word, and it means life. And no, the dots are important because dots make a big difference in Finnish.
Yeah. But that's also,
yeah,
I think that's more egregious because I'm an American. Yeah. An American, we don't have that stuff. We don't have any, the only ones we have are because it's a foreign word that we've just claimed as an American word. So, prodigy. We'll put the little asterisk over the E at the end of it because it's a French word. It's not even our word, but we didn't make up an American word for prodigy. We just stole that one and we're like, that's ours now. Yeah. But we don't do the two dots on anything. There's not a single American word. And so, that's something, especially in fantasy, that I can absolutely see somebody going, well, she just made this crap up and it's annoying. 100%.
But the thing about Elamar, I want the reader to just consume it. So I never italicize it. I never capitalize it. Right. I just write it and the reader moves along.
Yep.
And I treat, valid. Yeah, both are valid ways. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve.
And also understand that both ways are going to be fine for most people, but both ways, there's going to be a small group of people that don't like either way. Like, in other words, there's going to be people that are like, you capitalize too much. And there's going to be other people like, man, I really wish you'd capitalize some of these to kind of have them jump out so that I really can consume them as this special thing. Neither of those groups are going to be big on either side. They're just not going to be. But you got to understand, everything you do, every choice you make is going to be, someone's not going to like it, or not necessarily not like it so much that they put your book down, but you just can't please everybody. So if I went Marie's way and didn't capitalize anything, I'd still have a few people that were like, I really kind of wish you would have capitalized some of this stuff. Or I feel like, spectral should be capitalized. It's a proper noun of this thing of magic. So like, it's just going to happen. You're not going to get away from either side, whichever side you do, whichever way you take. And it's a lot of that. I mean, a lot of it where, like the sentence that we talked about with the run-on sentence with the M dash. Most people are just going to read that and it's going to be fine. But there's going to be people who are like, wow, that's just way too long, or it's a confusing sentence or whatever. Mm. That's a part of what we do. Everything we do is subjective. And so you just have to kind of get over that. All right. So there's still a lot more on this topic. We want to go over dialogue, and we want to go over scene breaks and chapter breaks and a few other topics on that. But we're kind of at an end. So what are you thinking?
I think that this is a great place to end this episode, and we will see you soon for another one on more punctuation.
Bye.